Well, if you've just been joining us, for the fall, we've been looking at the story of Abraham that you find in Genesis chapter 12 and then following. But for the last 2 weeks, we've probably covered one of the more famous stories in the Abraham narrative, which is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, a lot of times some people will know that Sodom and Gomorrah, they'll maybe be familiar with Sodom and Gomorrah, not knowing that it comes right in the middle of this Abraham narrative. And in this Abraham narrative, what we see is that God says that the sins of Sodom, he says there's these sins of Sodom that they're crying out to him. And so the way that this works is that when sins happen against you, by the way, also when you sin against somebody else, is that often that results in some sort of cry. I'm going to cry out. I'm going to cry out. And a lot of times you know this, that when you've been sinned against, one of the things that you do is you cry out to God. And the beautiful thing that we find in the story of Sodom is that God actually hears those cries. If you've ever been sinned against and you wonder, God, do you hear my cries? Know that the answer is yes, that he does. He hears those cries, and more than just that, is that those cries move him to action. And this is what we see in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, that the sins of Sodom have resulted in cries to God. He's heard those cries, and those cries have moved him to action. And that action is going to be specifically in the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, we looked at the story last week, is what happens is that these angels show up, and Lot is remember, he's the nephew of Abraham. And so that the angels show up, and what Lot thinks is that they're just strangers. And so I want to bring these strangers into my house, feed them, I'm going to sleep, going to sleep at night, and going to house them. And right after they're well fed, they're about to go to bed, is that the men of Sodom, it says young and old, the men of Sodom show up at Lot's door. And they said, where are those strangers that came with you today? We want them. And we want to, as would be indicated in the scriptures, we want to have sex with them. And what Lot says, don't do this wicked thing. It'd be essentially like a gang rape. Don't do this wicked thing. And he says, I have got 2 daughters that have known no men. In other words, they're 2 virgin daughters. Have them instead. And what I'm trying to make clear last week is what Abraham said, or so what Lot says is, don't do this wicked thing. Instead, do this other wicked thing over here. And this is what happens when probably you own a house and live in a place like Sodom. And so then they're coming after Lot. This is all the story from last week, but then the angels grabbed Lot, brought him inside, and then blinded the men of Sodom. It says that the men of Sodom, they wore themselves out groping for the door. And the angels say to Lot, who else is in this town that you know? Go warn them. So then Lot goes to basically the fiancés of his daughters and says, you guys, we got to go. Judgment is coming. And the son-in-laws think that he's joking. And then it says that then Lot is lingering. So the angels have said that Sodom is going to be destroyed. Judgment is coming. Then Lot lingers. And it says that the angels, they seize him and they literally drag him out of Sodom, and they tell him to go to the hills. And then so Lot says, well, I don't want to go to the hills. Can I go to this other lesser-known town, Zoar? And they're like, that's fine. Go to the lesser town, Zoar. But we can't bring destruction and judgment until you do. And so then Lot and his wife and his 2 daughters make their way to Zoar. Lot's wife looks back. She turns into a pillar of salt. And so then when Lot shows up in Zoar, it's just him and his 2 daughters. And then Sodom is then destroyed. Now, like I said last week, is that the story is not a story about the destruction of Sodom as much as it is the story about the salvation of Lot. Is that the epic stories in the Bible, the epic stories of judgment, are outweighed by the epic stories of salvation. And wherever we see judgment, we see salvation being given and secured. And so if what we do is we walk away from the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and go, God is a God of judgment, God is a judgment, but that's all that we think, and we're not overtaken by this idea, but God's also a God of salvation, then we miss the point of the story. And so this morning, we're going to jump into a story that comes out of that. It's like right on the heels of that. And what we would hope, really, if I'm going to be honest, what I would hope at least is I would hope that when God judges judges Sodom, is that you go, okay, that's it. Like sin is done. Like sin has been eradicated. Like God brought his judgment against Sodom and Gomorrah, and now sin is taken care of, except for this morning we're going to go into a darker story. And remember, this comes right on the heels of God judging, we say, the great sins of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so we want it to take care of it, but it doesn't. In fact, actually, this morning's story, this is spoiler alert / warning, is that this is going to be a story about a father sleeping with his 2 daughters. So, incest. And you go, this is what's come out of Sodom. Now, I was reading, because you know what, when I preach on a passage, I like to sometimes hear other preachers preach on the passage and go, what do they do? How do they handle this? Turns out, very, very difficult to find somebody who's preached on this passage this morning. Weird enough, like I could not really find it. And, but I did, somebody had referred to this passage and they said, man, the Bible's so messed up. And I thought, is it the Bible messed up or is it we that are messed up? I mean, isn't that the thing? We read these stories in the Bible, and go, oh, the Bible's so messed up. It's like, well, it could be that the Bible's messed up, or it could be that the Bible accurately records the fact that we are messed up. And I think what the Bible does is the Bible accurately records that we are messed up. But to the person who said, man, the Bible's so messed up, I'm like, 1, no, it's we that are messed up, and the Bible accurately records that. And then 2, is that I think that they made the mistake that because it's in the Bible that God condones it. You know, very rarely, and we even talked about this last week a little bit, but very rarely will you come across the Bible and it will tell you a story, and then the story will, and then the narrative will say, and that was wrong, and that was wrong, and that was wrong. And we think that because it doesn't do that, then we think that somehow the Bible condones that. And I'd go, no. The Bible, I think, is the best well-told story of all of human history. And all really good storytellers, rarely would they ever tell you straight out, that was wrong. They bring the story to this place where you're revolted. And they don't fill in the blank for you. I mean, you think about the good movies, the good books that you watch. As you're watching a good movie and then something happens, you're like, no! You don't need somebody in the narrative to tell you. And by the way, guys, this is a bad thing that just happened right here. We all know it. We all feel it. We all sense it. And so just because the Bible doesn't say that explicitly at times doesn't mean that it condones it. And so certainly this morning would fall, as I would say, into that category. So with that being said, piqued your interest? We're going to look at Genesis 19, verse 30. It says this. Now Lot went up out of Zoar and lived in the hills with his 2 daughters, for he was afraid to live in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his 2 daughters. So Lot leaves out of fear, out of Zoar. Remember, he was leaving out of Sodom, and what the angel said to him was, "I'll go to the hills." And what Lot says to the angels, I don't want to go to the hills. Can you send me to Zoar? And then the angels are like, fine, we'll spare Zoar, but just basically get out of here. And I love what Lot does is he's in Zoar for a little while. He's afraid. We don't know what he's afraid of. He's afraid of something, but he's afraid of something. And where does he go? He goes to the hills. Where did the angels try to tell him to go in the first place? To the hills. And I go, I love this part of the story because I think this is us, this is me, this is you. Parents, have you ever had this happen to you? You ask your kid to do something, hey, can you do that? And they hem and they haw and they go, I don't want to go there. I don't want to do that. I don't want to eat that. I want to go here or eat this instead. You're like, and you're thinking to yourself, you can, but I don't think you're going to like that as much as you're going to like this. And so I want this, and they keep on stomping their foot, whatever. They keep on wanting that, and then finally like, fine. I think you're going to like this, but I think you like this better. But if you want the lesser of the two, then you can go ahead and do that. and then your child engages in that, or they do that, or they eat that thing, they go, I don't like this. I want that other thing. You're like, that's what I said to begin with. And the frustration and all of the parents, like you rise and you know what this is like. This happens, right? This happens with children and parents. This happens with us and with God. God says, I want you to do this. You're like, but I don't want to do it, God. I want to do this thing over here instead. I want you to do this. I don't want to do that. I want to do this over instead. And finally God's like, fine, do that thing. And then you do that thing and God's like, then you're like, actually, God, I want to do the thing you originally told me to do. And God's like, yeah, that's kind of what I was trying to get at in the first place. Go to the hills. I thought to myself, why does this keep on happening? Well, it keeps on happening because children are stubborn and because parents know better, right? Children are stubborn and parents know better. And that is true, by the way, that was true when you were a child. You're still stubborn today, but you were stubborn as a child, and your parents, most of the time, not always, right? But your parents knew better. And the same thing is true, right, when it comes to our relationship with God, is that we are stubborn, right, and God knows better. And so what we see here is we see Lot finds himself in the very place the angels were trying to send him in the beginning. Then it said this, verse 31. And the firstborn said to the younger, our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come to us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve offspring for our father. And so right on the heels of Sodom and Gomorrah, we get two daughters that are wanting to sleep, not for sexual gratification purposes, but for childbearing purposes, come up with this idea that maybe we should sleep with our father. Once again, we would hope that in God's judgment of Sodom, what it would do is eradicate sin. But what it does is it sort of like puts a limit on sin. And truth be told is that there is a day coming. There is a day coming when God's judgment on all of the world will eradicate sin once and for all. So this is interesting. That's what we want. The good news is that's in our future, is there is coming a day where the judgment of God will eradicate sin from the world. But until that day, what we often see is that the judgment of God, what it does is it puts a limit on the effects of sin. But we still see sin seeping out. And here what we see is the effects of sin seeping out. And interestingly enough, last week what we saw Lot. What did Lot say? I've got two daughters, have them instead. In other words, last week Lot was trying to sexually exploit his daughters for his own gain. And this week, what do we see? What is good for the goose is good for the gander, I guess, is that his two daughters are trying to exploit sexually their father for their gain. Now, what's their fear? Their fear is that no man would come to us, and this is probably a decent fear, right? I mean, because Sodom and Gomorrah has been destroyed, but we know that they know that there's men because they just came from a town of Zoar. And so maybe they're like, well, we've seen Zoar. There are no good men in Zoar. But what are their fear? Their fear is that no man would come to us and no child would come from us. No man would come to us, no child will come from us. And by the way, this is not a good, in case you need me to state this out clearly, I will say it out clearly. This is a horrible idea. This is not a good plan. It's interesting because there are some times with culture, okay, so culturally speaking, this was a bad idea, guys. You may not know it because we're thousands of miles away. We don't get this culture, but in this culture, thousands of years ago, this was a bad idea. There are other things that happen in the Bible where you go, I don't care where it's happening, when in time it happens, what culture it happens, it's just universally sick and twisted. And I would say that fathers sleeping with their daughters is one of them. And so you shouldn't need me, you shouldn't need the Bible, although the Bible in other places speaks against this, but you shouldn't need the Bible to tell you this is a wicked thing. This is, we would say, is a bad idea. And this bad idea actually comes out of the fear. What is the fear? That no man would come to us and no child would come from us. if what you're doing is you're making decisions based in fear, is that often you will make unfaithful decisions. I'm going to talk with people all the time. Why would you do that? I was afraid. What did you think? Did you think that God was honored by that? No, I knew God was like, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. So why'd you do it? I was afraid. I go, yeah. Yeah, you know why? Because when we make decisions based out of fear, we will make horrible decisions. And by the way, that's true for Abraham. That's true for Sarah. That's true for Lot. And now we know that it's true for his daughters. And it's also true for you. Whether you're afraid of our culture, of our politics, of our political environment, of COVID, of job security, of family relationships. When you make decisions based out of fear, it's often you end up making unfaithful decisions. And evidently that Lot would not have been on board with this. And one of the reasons why he wouldn't be on board with it, because they feel as if they needed to get him drunk in order to do this. In other words, if he was sober, then he would not engage in this. And so we got to get him drunk, and we find that they don't know when he comes in, when they come in or go or leave, that they got to get him drunk in order to do this. But let me also be very clear, is that when detestable acts like this happen, everybody is responsible. For instance, their fear is that no man would come to them, no child would come from them. I go, not a good excuse. You're still responsible. Lot, I was drunk. I didn't even know. Wasn't even my idea. I'd go, Lot, not a good excuse. You're still accountable. Much like in today, even with those that work or are coming or recovering addicts, right? As it goes, well, that wasn't me. I was loaded. I was drunk. And part of the realization is to go, yeah, like you may not remember that, but you are still responsible and accountable for your decisions and your actions. And so even though there's a decision made out of fear, there is a passivity that is born out of drunkenness, is that everybody is responsible. Verse 33. So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she arose. The next day, the firstborn said to the younger, behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go and lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father. So they made their father drink wine that night also. And the younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Thus both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. It would be one thing to have sex with your father. It would be a whole nother thing to then be carrying your father's child. There's all sorts of wrong here. And it's interesting is that there's a lot that I want to know about the story that this doesn't tell us. By the way, you thought last week's story was depraved. We get this one. And I'll tell you what, they didn't tell us this in Sunday school. Like, I don't remember like this flannel graph of this story, because I think I would have remembered that. Like, that's not good. But there's interesting, there's a lot of things about this story that I want to know that we're not even told. Like, I want to know, like what happened? Like, when and how did Lot find out that they were pregnant? Because by the way, it would be scandalous in this culture to be not married and pregnant. And so that would be scandalous enough. So I wonder, like, at what point did he figure out that they were pregnant? Did they tell him? And if so, how did he respond? The other thing I want to know is at what point, was at the same point, or was there a different point where they found out that he was the father? He doesn't have memory of this. He doesn't remember. He doesn't know when they came in or when they laid down or when they got up and left. And how does he respond to that? What's his, like, is he angry? Is he sad? Is he grieved? Is he sickened? Is he all of those? It doesn't tell us. It's funny because a lot of the things I want to know about this story, it doesn't tell us. But it does tell us the things that we need to know. Look at verse 37. The firstborn of the son, and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son and called his name Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites to this day. And so Moab and Ben-Ami were born, and they give birth to two nations, to the Moabites and the Ammonites. And it's interesting because every family has its dirty little secrets and shameful past, right? You think about your family for a second. Dirty little secrets, shameful past. And a lot of times, in interesting ways, is that sometimes like couples will argue about whose family has dirtier secrets and more shameful past. And they may even drag up stuff that hasn't come up in 20 years of marriage. Be like, well, actually, my uncle and this and that. They go, oh my gosh, that is horrible. But you think about your own family. Dirty little secrets, shameful past. And in these places we reflect, and what we see here in the Bible is we see dirty little secrets, shameful past. And then there may be divorces, children born out of wedlock, children that are the result of an affair, criminal activity, shameful actions, stealing, theft, addiction. Every family has its dirty little secrets and shameful past. Now you can be thankful that your family's dirty little secrets and shameful past were not canonized in Scripture. For all of human history to read. I mean, those are things we just like, once you're in the family for about 10 years, now we can tell you some of them because you're not going to run away now. But actually, what if they were canonized in Scripture? And all of a sudden, you're actually feeling a little bit better about your family's dirty little secrets and shameful past. Like, actually, it's not that bad. It's not that bad. Like, there's not this, but maybe there is this in your history. And we even hear these stories today. And so you think, well, how shameful it would be for this family. The name Moab, many would believe, is that the Moab, the way that it's literally translated, the meaning of the word would be seed or water of the father. Let that sink in for a second. Actually, the child's name is, now we would say, yes, that I came from my father, but she's also thinking, you came from my father. Ben-Ami would be son of my kinsman. So, to describe this, right, is that Lot is it's her kinsman. It's kin, and you are son of my kinsman. That's their name. I mean, this is not just a shameful like past or a shameful deed. This is actually something that bears on their identity. Like who they are, what people will call them. I was thinking this week, I was like, maybe the closest we could get to, right, is we understand like the technical definition of the term bastard would to be an illegitimate child. And so maybe some kid would say that on the playground, like, you bastard, and then they start fighting, whatever. But what if that was actually your name? What if you were born in out of an illegitimate relationship or something, so that you would fit the technical definition of the term bastard, and that's actually what your mom and your dad decided to call you. Like, that was your name. Moab, seed of the father. Ben-Ami, son of my kinsman. And not only is this an identity for them, this is an identity then for nations. The Moabites, and this is what it's saying, is that the Moabites and the Ammonites. And the whole idea where he says, to this day, what it does is it takes us actually to the day in which the author, I believe Moses, is writing this. He goes, so we all know the Ammonites. This is where they've come from. We all know the Moabites, right? This is where they've come from. And so not only is this a shameful identity for these two sons, this is going to be a shameful identity that is going to carry out throughout the Moabite people and throughout the Ammonite people. The Moabites and the Ammonites are going to go on to be enemies of Israel. This is what's going to be very interesting. Remember, God had promised a great nation through Abraham. And now the birth of the Ammonites and the Moabites are going to be the great enemies. And the reason why I do this is because I know that sometimes when you start hearing about the people of the Bible, they all start to blur together. It's like, I don't know, there's the Ammonites and the Amorites and the Philistines and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Moabites, and it all starts to blend. But these were people. And so what we see is actually the Moabites and the Ammonites become enemies of Israel. Think about this. God is establishing the people of Israel through Abraham, and then through Lot is going to come two of their great enemies. And not only are they going to be great enemies of God, but these are going to be two people that were born out of an incestuous relationship that will directly oppose the people of God. And what's crazier than that is actually they're going to go on to worship other gods. The Moabites are going to go on to worship a god known as Chemosh, which is the land of war. He's the god of war, or the god of land. You can see how war and land would go together. When you go to war, you get land. And so they would worship him. The Ammonites would worship the god of Molech, or the god of fire. And the way that they would worship the god of fire is they would take their children, their sons and their daughters, and they would burn them alive on the altar of Molech. There's a lot to be said about that. There's a lot that actually God speaks, because then the people of Israel actually adopt the practices of that, and they start burning their own children on the altar of Molech. And truth be told, like, we will look back at sometimes with their culture and practices and go, how barbaric. And I think before we did that, we would be wise to look at our own culture and practices before we deem theirs barbaric. So you think to yourself, how does these incestuous, these people that were born out of an incestuous relationship that are going to go on and directly oppose the people of God and worship false gods? We go, well, this is like a problematic story. And this is all on the heels, right? Remember, of Sodom and Gomorrah. God came against Sodom and Gomorrah before its sins. The first story we get out of that is a story of incest that will lead to two groups of people that will directly oppose the will of God, the people of God, and lead to then false worship. Now you know why people don't preach this story. So why do I tell it to you? Why do we even spend time in this? So that you could feel better about your own families? Well, right before Thanksgiving, like, hey, you know what? Actually, you guys are pretty good. Like, you're not so bad. Yeah, maybe. Hopefully it helps, right? But I think there's something greater. Do you guys know, this can be a trick, but some of you may know this, maybe not, at home. Do you know who the most famous Moabite is? Ruth. Yeah, I know you guys at home were screaming at your television, it's Ruth! But no, yeah, or some of you guys, I got no clue. But it's Ruth. Ruth is the most famous Moabite. Now, if you're not familiar with the story of Ruth, I would highly encourage you to read the story of Ruth. And you can find it in, wait for it, the book of Ruth. Like, whoa! Yeah, it's the book of Ruth. It's about Ruth, and Ruth is a Moabite. Ruth is of the descendant of seed of my father. But actually what was beautiful is about the story of Ruth is that as it opens up, we get the story of Naomi, who's married to Elimelech. And they've got two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And a famine hits the land of Israel. And so guess where the family goes? They go to Moab. And guess what happens in the land of Moab? Well, their sons find daughters. But also what happens in the land of Moab is that Elimelech dies, and then the two sons die. And so here now Naomi is with Ruth and Orpah, who are two Moabites. And so there's all of the men have died, and in a culture that is patriarchal like this, that's death. And so she gets word that food is back in the land of Israel. And so she's going to return. And upon returning, she tells to both Orpah and Ruth, who are both Moabite women and have both lost their husbands. Naomi says, go back to your families. Because basically, I'm a widow now. I'm not going to have, she's like, I'm old. I'm not going to have more sons. You're not going to wait for another son out of my womb. Just go back home to your families. And it says that Orpah does, but do you know what it says about Ruth? It says that Ruth clung to her. And do you know what Ruth says to Naomi? She says, I will go where you go. I will lodge where you lodge. But most beautifully, you know what she says? Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Because what Naomi had told her is says, I want you to go back to your people and go back to your gods. And what Ruth tells Naomi is, I want to go with you, and your people will become my people, and your God will become my God. And so she goes back. Naomi and Ruth, this beautiful story, and it just so happens that Ruth finds herself, because they did this thing called gleaning, where basically they would harvest some of the food, but not all of the food, so that people could come behind and pick some up to eat. And so Ruth just happened to be gleaning in the field of one Mr. Boaz. And Boaz was a close family member of Naomi. And longer story made a little bit shorter, is that Boaz actually cares for Ruth. But it's interesting what Boaz says. Boaz says, I've heard what you've done to Ruth. He says, I've heard what you've done for your mother-in-law. It's almost like Boaz is like, and trust me, nobody does that for their mother-in-law. Like, nobody does that for their mother-in-law. Even like historically, nobody does that for their mother-in-law. I heard what you did for your mother-in-law. And what Boaz does is Boaz redeems Ruth. And so Boaz and Ruth, because of Ruth's faithfulness, Boaz marries her and produces a child. Now remember, this child is at least 50% Moabite. Gives birth to the son named Obed. Obed goes on to father Jesse. And then Jesse goes on to father David, the great King David. It's the great king of Israel, great king of Jerusalem. It's David's throne. 3 generations of Moabite. But what we also know about the line of David is that the line of David is actually where Jesus comes from. And so, that chapter in Matthew, as it opens up, you're like, good night, I can't do any of this. Where's the healing stuff? As you jump right into that, and you pass through the genealogy, like, where's the feeding of the 5,000? I like that stuff. As you're booking through that stuff, but was actually, there's a huge, point there. But guess who we see in the lineage of Jesus? Ruth. The Moabite, the seed of my father, the one that was born of this incestuous relationship, opposing the people of God, worshiping other gods. And we see her in the line of the Messiah. The reason why I stopped and I wanted to preach this passage this morning is because I wanted you to know this, that the depraved stories always have a path of redemption. The depraved stories always have a path of redemption. We even we go into this, we're going through this, this is a train wreck of a story. How did you think to yourself, how could anything ever good come out of this? You go, because even in the most depraved stories in the Bible, there is always a path of redemption. And by the way, the redemption does not justify the depravity. In other words, because I was reading some stuff this last week, and someone's like, why would this happen? Why would they do this? And somebody said, well, because basically God needed the Messiah to come from. I go, no, God didn't need any of this to happen. Don't use the fact that God redeems it as a way to justify it. I feel no need to do that. I don't need to come to the story of this and go, man, this is a tragedy, but this had to happen in order that the Messiah could be born. I go, nope, I reject that. And if you talk with me about other stuff, I make the distinction between what God uses and what he causes. He didn't cause this, but he used it. God doesn't cause everything, but he uses everything. And for the most depraved story, there is always a path of redemption. You don't believe it? It's right here. It's a redemption that takes thousands of years to come to fruition, but it's here. And the beautiful thing is that this is not limited to the pages of the Bible. That your stories of depravity have a path of redemption. And when you lose hope, it's because you believe that there is no redemption possible. And hear me on this. If there is no redemption possible, you should lose hope. If really is the answer to what good can come of this, if the answer is nothing, then you should lose hope. But that is not the Christian perspective. This is the Christian perspective, that even the most depraved stories have a path of redemption. That's true for you, by the way. That's true also for you and for your family. I know that even as I'm talking about shameful families and shameful past and dirty secrets, that you have your own. And maybe you come from I was born and raised in a Christian home, but we still have our dirty secrets and shameful past. But I was born in a Christian home, but some of you weren't born in Christian homes. And even as you look at your family, your upbringing, your lineage, you may think to yourself, what good can come of this? But the most depraved stories always have a path of redemption. That's true for you, and that's true for your family. I was thinking about some of you this week, leading into this. I know that some of you come from these kinds of families, as we would say. And really, my prayer for you is that not only would your personal depraved story lead to the path of redemption, but your familial story, as depraved as it is, that God would use you to bring about the path of redemption. I think like I said, the Bible most accurately records the depravity of humanity, but it also records God's path to redemption. That's my prayer for you, prayer for us, even as we think about our culture, even as we put Genesis aside for a little bit, that we would resonate with this, and we would kind of I thought this is a good place to leave it. That even the most depraved stories have a path of redemption.